Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Sunday. I'm Dr. Gregory, and you're watching episode 3 of Dr. Gregory's Meta Moments. Today we're going to be talking about the book, The Biology of Belief, one of my favorites. It was written by Dr. Bruce Lipton, PhD. And just a little background on Dr. Lipton. He is the father of epigenetics. He has studied cellular biology for decades, over 4 decades, I believe. He's also has been and is very experienced in teaching the curriculum in medical schools. What was interesting about this is that through his studies and research, he learned more about epigenetics and the power of the environment and how it can impact a cell's life. And a cell is just a small portion of our body. We are a collection of 50 trillion cells. And what he was seeing was that the environment was creating impacts that were actually hereditarily passed to future generations, which went completely against the dogma that we have all been taught in medical school, that our genes, our DNA, determine our future, determine our physical life. And in some cases, some people have gone as far to believe that our genetics determines our emotional future as well. So this book is, in summary, to explain how there are other factors that affect your physical being. So let's just start with the prologue, because I highlighted some really important points in both the prologue as well as in the introduction chapters, which I'm going to be going through today. And then I'll delve a little bit into them to explain more and make it more understandable for the audience. Let's go into this book. Now, in the prologue, he says, "My life-changing moment occurred while I was reviewing my research on the mechanisms by which cells control their physiology and behavior. Suddenly, I realized a cell's life is fundamentally controlled by the physical and energetic environment with only a small contribution by its genes. Genes are simply molecular blueprints used in the construction of cells, tissues, and organs. The environment serves as the contractor who reads and engages those genetic blueprints and is ultimately responsible for the character of the cell's life." And cell, translate that into organism. If a single cell's awareness of the environment, it's the single cell's awareness of the environment that primarily sets into motion mechanisms of life. So the cell's perception of its environment is brought back into the cell and affects, that's where epigenetics happens, affects the blueprint and how it is read, and hence that's how the character of the cell is determined. The blueprint itself is not the signal, the environment is. Isn't that interesting? So, just like a single cell, the character of our lives is determined not by our genes, but by our response to the environmental signals that propel life. That's a game changer. And that goes against the central dogma that we've been taught in medical school. DNA goes to RNA, which builds proteins, which determine our being, who we are, and that everything we are is determined by our DNA. That is simply not the case. And it can be shown further in this book, and over the course of the chapters that we will review, you will see how and why, with backed up scientific data. So he says, "My new understanding of the nature of life not only corroborated my stem cell research, but I realized it contradicted another belief of the mainstream science at the time. I'd been propounding to my students that the belief that allopathic medicine is the only kind of medicine that merits consideration in medical school. By finally giving an energy-based environment its due, it provided for a grand convergence, united the science and practice of allopathic medicine, complementary medicine, and the spiritual wisdom of ancient and modern faiths." So you are not beholden to your DNA. That's pretty exciting. So getting into another portion of the introduction, he talks a little bit about Darwin, and here's a little chapter or a paragraph about that. "It's not that Darwin denied the existence of God. He simply implied that chance, not divine intervention, was responsible for the character of life on Earth. In his 1859 book, The Origin of Species, Darwin said, individual traits are passed from parents to children, and suggested that hereditary factors pass from parent to child control the characteristics of an individual's life. That bit of insight set scientists off into a frenzied attempt to dissect life down to its molecular nuts and bolts. Hence, Watson and Crick discovering the DNA double strands. And like in the tabloids, the biologists jumped onto this bandwagon of genes. And they basically created that central dogma, which is painstakingly spelled out in textbooks. The central dogma goes from DNA to RNA to protein synthesis, and that is the only path that is created to determine your physical, emotional outcome. But that's simply not the case. So let's keep going. The central dogma is basically genes control life. That scientific premise, though, has one major flaw. Genes cannot turn themselves on or off. Big detail to note here. In scientific terms, genes are not self-emergent. They are not the signal, if that makes sense. They are the blueprint. Something in the environment has to trigger the gene activity. Though that fact has already been established by frontier science, conventional scientists are still blinded by the genetic dogma and have simply ignored it. Epigenetics is the study of molecular mechanisms by which the environment controls gene activity. It is today one of the most active areas of scientific research. So he basically used cell communities as role models and came to the conclusion that we're not victims of our genes, but we are masters of our fate. And we are able to create lives overflowing with peace, happiness, and love, and health and well-being. We are that powerful. We are not powerless biochemical machines. And popping a pill every time we are mentally or physically out of tune is not the answer. Drugs and surgery are powerful tools when they're not overused. But the notion of a single drug fix is fundamentally flawed. Every time a drug is introduced into the body to correct function A, it inevitably throws off function B, C, or D. It is not gene-directed hormones and neurotransmitters that control our bodies and our minds. Our beliefs control our bodies and our minds, and thus our lives. Isn't that exciting? This gives you so much more power as the patient or the person in general. So let's get on to what he says. Are you ready to consider an alternate reality that's provided by the medical model, a reality in which the human body is not simply a biochemical machine? Are you ready to use your subconscious and conscious minds to create a life overflowing with health, happiness, and love without the aid of genetic engineers and without addicting yourself to drugs? There's nothing to buy. There are no policies to take out. It's a matter of temporarily suspending the archaic beliefs you've acquired from the scientific and media establishments so you consider the exciting new awareness offered by leading edge science. I'm so excited about this book, guys. We're going to probably head into chapter 1 soon. Not sure if that's going to be next week, but he's going to go into more detail about how the environment impacts our bodies. And he starts at the cellular level. And I'll be able to explain it to you in more layman's terms at the cellular level and how that translates into the body as a whole. Our body is a collection of over 50 trillion cells, and they work in community. And unlike Darwin's original theory, which has turned out to have some fundamental flaws in it, that individuals fight for their fitness, if you will, and that the community is more at odds with one another and the survival of the fittest occurs through conflict, it's not the case. And it also, the book that Darwin wrote, talks about how genes are supposedly, well, he doesn't know about genes at the time, but he basically talked about how traits are passed on somehow hereditarily and that they are done randomly. So can you imagine that we are evolving because of random gene mutations? That would require a significant amount of transformation. And that's really just not the case when you start studying in the real life sense and you start doing cellular cloning studies like he has and realizing what the reality is, which is far beyond a hereditary predetermined future. It involves your environment. Pretty exciting. Thanks for watching, everybody. I really appreciate your time. Have a great Sunday.